So we know that your microbiome, this constellation of bacteria, viruses, fungal organisms, protozoa that live in and on our bodies, the more than 100 trillion microbes, are a huge determinant of whether you get a disease or not. You can have the genes that confer an increased likelihood of celiac disease or Crohn's or MS or cancer, but the epigenetic factors, the environmental factors, the things that we're exposed to are a huge determinant of whether that disease actually develops or not. And we know microbes in the gut can actually turn genes on and off. And that happens very quickly. And so what genes are activated or inactivated very much depends on what food you're eating and what microbes are present. So it's all really connected.
The Vidal Speaks podcast.
Episode 70, Dr. Robynne Chutkan, the Microbiome Solution and the Importance of a Healthy Gut on Our Overall Health. Welcome to Vidal Speaks. My name is Deborah Vidal, former 11-year LPGA golf pro turned classical homeopath, certified plant-based nutritionist, and wellness coach. Each week here on Vidal Speaks, we bring you knowledge, inspiration, or natural remedies to help you take charge of your health and feel your best. I believe health is freedom and knowledge is power. So tuning in each week will give you the power to take steps towards freeing yourself from the chains that hold you back from having the energy to do all you want in life. No matter where you are in your journey of wellness, Vidal Speaks can help. I promise. Welcome, my old friends and new ones. In case this is your first or second time here, I'm Deborah Vidal, also known as Vidal to some, and this is my podcast called Vidal Speaks. It is here on this show that you will learn so much about all kinds of ways to get well. It is here also where you will finally learn the truth behind why eating a plant-powered diet is in the long term the only one that can reverse chronic disease or lifestyle diseases. I speak about the true cause of most of our medical conditions, syndromes, or mystery illnesses, and the myths behind many of the treatments. But the best thing is, it is also here that you will learn what you can do to take charge and heal yourself and all of those you love. Most importantly, I want you guys to become the experts so you can not only heal yourself, but you can help others. Because as you know, and as I have said for over a year now, that I want this show to become a movement for people to take charge of their health. The best way to do that is to tune in every Wednesday and listen to every show so you can learn exactly what you need to if you're in a situation now or just have to have the knowledge in case anything happens to you or your loved ones. Once you have that knowledge, then you know how to take action when you need it. And of course, you'll learn how to fill your wellness toolbox with powerful products, books, remedies, recipes, and many other awesome products to make you feel your best or pull you out of your illness. You know, in my 20-year clinical practice, it seemed that almost every patient I saw had some kind of gut issue, and even ones that didn't, when I worked on cleaning their colon and their liver, many of their complaints got better. It was not too long after I started my practice that I realized how many people have gut issues. I remember a long time before I started my practice, I would hear the saying, "You are only as healthy as your gut." Well, that statement became the truth every year of my practice. It seemed that patients that had gut issues had lots of battles with their health. And that's what's hard as a clinician. There are so many kinds of different gut issues. There's bloating, acid reflux, ulcers, gut pain, constipation, diarrhea, IBS, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis. And then there's food allergies and gastric headaches, and the list goes on and on. And every year, more and more patients seem to have gut issues. And I would always ask myself, what's going on? It's taken me a lot of years to understand this in a more complex way, But one simple explanation is the overprescribing of antibiotics have created a large population of sick people now with unhealthy gut bacteria and lots of out of balance microbiomes. So you're going to love my guest today. Her name is Robynne Chutkan, and she is the microbiome specialist. Dr. Chutkan is going to teach us all what she has learned in her helping people with gut issues. And believe me, you may think you don't have one, but usually underlying any illness lies a problem in the gut. So this is an episode that's very important for everyone. I bought her book, The Microbiome Solution, when it came out, and it was a great read, so I suggest you read it too. You can find the link in the show notes for that. Okay, before we go meet Dr. Chutkan, let me tell you a little bit more about her. Dr. Chutkan is the author of the best-selling digestive health book, Gutbliss, The Microbiome Solution, and The Bloat Cure. She received her bachelor's from Yale University and her medical degree from Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York, where she also did her internship and residency and served as chief resident. She completed her fellowship in gastroenterology at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Dr. Chutkan has been on the faculty at Georgetown University Hospital since 1997. In 2004, she founded the Digestive Center for Wellness and integrative gastroenterology practice incorporating microbial optimization, nutritional therapy, biofeedback, and stress reduction as part of the therapeutic approach to digestive orders. A former board member of the American Society for Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, Dr. Chutkan also chaired the FASGE Training Committee and Public Relations Committee. She has authored dozens of journal articles and books, chapters, and has been a featured lecturer throughout the United States and Europe. Dr. Chutkan is a regular guest on the Dr. Oz Show covering digestive health and is also a member of the Medical Advisory Board for the show. She was the host of the National Institute of Health Clinical Roundtable series and a medical consultant and on-air talent for Discovery Health Channel. She has been a featured expert on the Today Show, CBS This Morning, and The Doctors, and is frequently interviewed as a medical expert for the Washington Post and Women's Health magazines. She is an avid runner, snowboarder, and yogi, and is passionate about helping her patients live not just longer, but dirtier lives. Okay, you guys ready to go meet Dr. Chutkan now? Here we go. Hello, Dr. Chutkan. I know you're an integrative gastroenterologist and I've heard you speak, and your work is very fascinating. So I'm so happy to have you on the Vidal Speaks podcast to teach us all about the importance of the microbiome and its implications on our health. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be with you today.
Look, I have to ask you first because you're a medical doctor, and I know from being growing up with a dad who's in the medical world, I know that traditional training doesn't teach integrative medicine, and now you're on this path. So I would like to know, first of all, how did you go from your regular training to where you are today?
So I actually grew up in a medical family too. My dad is a retired orthopedic surgeon. My brother's an orthopedic surgeon. And I thought I would be an orthopedic surgeon. And about 7 minutes into my orthopedic surgery rotation, I realized it was not for me. But I ended up in gastroenterology. And I trained at Columbia. But then for my gastroenterology training, I was at Columbia for medical school and residency. For gastroenterology, I trained at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is a hospital where Dr. Crohn, as well as his colleagues, Dr. Oppenheimer and Ginsburg, first described Crohn's disease in the 1930s. So that hospital had a very rich history of treating patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And I had great training, but I never during my gastroenterology fellowship heard anybody talk about this idea of food as medicine and treating autoimmune diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis naturally. The mantra definitely was, these are autoimmune diseases. You got to treat them with medications, and you sort of have to hit them with heavy guns. And that was essentially just how it was done. And we never really questioned it. my whole transition into integrative medicine and integrative gastroenterology really began when I finished my training. I was on faculty at Georgetown. Believe it or not, when I joined the faculty in 1997, they had never had a woman in their gastroenterology division.
Wow.
And I know it's a little bit shocking. Now we train lots of women at Georgetown, but gastroenterology is a field where about 70% of the patients are female, but only about 7 or 8% of the doctors. So just by virtue of my gender, Deborah, I had a lot of patients who were interested in coming to see me. And what I found is that a lot of them were interested in what they could do to make themselves better. And this is a real generalization. I know lots of men out there who also want to know what they can do to make themselves better. But this was just my experience at the time in gastroenterology, seeing a lot of women who wanted to know, what can I do for my reflux? How can I heal my Crohn's? They had lots of questions, and I did not have any answers. So I set out trying to find out some answers and trying to answer that question that we are so bad at answering in medicine, which is why. We know how to answer what. We know what you have. You have Crohn's, you have ulcerative colitis, you have reflux. But why is something that we're really not taught to answer in medical school. And when patients asked me why, I didn't know what to tell them. I just, said, well, you have an autoimmune disease and there's sort of a genetic predisposition and maybe there's an environmental trigger, but you don't really know what it is. And I started experimenting on myself with diet, even though I was healthy, and with my patients. And my patients were generous enough to share with me what they were doing. A lot of them were taking conventional medicine, but they were also doing other things. They were doing Chinese herbs. They were doing fish oil. They were doing probiotics. They were doing acupuncture. They were doing dietary therapy. And one of the diets that a lot of the patients with inflammatory bowel disease back then and even now still do is a diet called a specific carbohydrate diet, otherwise known as SCD. It was actually sort of created by Dr. Elson Haas back in the 50s, but popularized by Elaine Gottschall in her book, Breaking the Vicious Cycle, which was written about 30 years ago. And Elaine Gottschall had a child. It's a little unclear now, years later, whether the child had ulcerative colitis or celiac disease, but a child who was very ill and was sort of written off by the medical community. And Dr. Haas was very helpful to her. And the specific carbohydrate diet is sort of a first cousin of the paleo diet. It's a diet that excludes a lot of processed carbohydrates and sugars and so on. And I found that patients were doing the diet and they were doing well. And I remember my first patient, who was a young woman. At the time, she was about the same age I was. And she worked at Georgetown. She had left the hospital to go work at another hospital in New Jersey. She came back. She had had very, very severe Crohn's disease and was on a lot of medication. She came back. She looked great. She said she was feeling great. And she wasn't on any medication. And this was just crazy to me. I was like, what do you mean you're not on anything? And she said, I'm not taking anything and I feel fine. So I said, well, you're overdue for your colonoscopy. I know you're feeling fine, but I doubt things are looking good. Let's take a look. It looked amazing. All her chronic ulceration was healed. And wow. I literally could not believe it. It was like magic to me. The very idea that somebody could heal a chronic autoimmune disease like Crohn's disease just with diet was completely foreign and outrageous to me. And I'm so proud to say, Deborah, that, 15 years later, that's primarily what we do. I went from being probably the largest prescriber of these biologic drugs in the area to now the largest unprescriber. People come to me to get off of drugs like Remicade and prednisone and Imuran and so on. And it's a work that I'm most proud of is helping patients with chronic autoimmune disease to heal the gut.
Wow, how fantastic it is to feel, because all doctors really go into medicine to want to help and heal people, and
Absolutely.
Healing can be looked at in many different ways, but to give a drug and kind of suppress a symptom and the person still chronically suffers is not really making you feel like you've healed them in any way. So I can imagine how rewarding it must feel now that you can get people off these drugs. And these drugs are so difficult on the body because a lot of these, especially like Remicade and these things where they suppress your immune system, I had a couple friends on those drugs and then they get a pneumonia and they die because they have no immune system to fight. So
absolutely. And you made some really important points there. Number one, I believe most physicians are well-meaning. They want patients to get better. But number two, I think the average patient does not realize that our medical education has been completely hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry.
For sure.
Not just what we're taught in medical school, but the postgraduate education, which is where most of our learning actually happens. So, for example, I was on the board of one of our large gastroenterology societies, the American Society for Gastrointestinal Endoscopy. And during my 3-year tenure on the board, I suggested at one of our board meetings that at our big international GI meeting, which is generally about 20,000 gastroenterologists, that for the plenary session, we should not invite anybody to speak who has a formal association with a drug company, who's getting a grant, receiving funding, and so on. So number one, they all looked at me like I was crazy. And number two, then they all said, well, we wouldn't have anybody to speak.
Wow.
And the way that we handle conflict of interest in medicine, meaning you're receiving tons of money from a drug company for research or some other support, is we throw up a slide that's our disclosure slide that says Dr. So-and-so is receiving funding from, and it's usually a long list. Sometimes it's a dozen or more pharmaceutical companies. And then we carry on with the talk. And as far as the medical community is concerned, we've handled the conflict. There is no more conflict because we've disclosed it. And so what the drug companies have done is they identify what they call key opinion leaders, KOLs. And there's a lot of ego stroke involved, believe me. Oh, Dr. Chutkan, you're such a thought leader, and we heard your talk, and you're so respected. So there's a lot of buttering up that goes on, number one. And then they invite you to come give a talk at some meeting. And so, you're feeling so complimented that they've asked me to come speak at this national conference. And for me, my experience was it starts out as, you're such a thought leader in this field. We'd like you to give a talk to a group of local physicians. And our research and development team will provide you with some slides that you can use to complement your talk. And so you get a slide deck, and maybe you use some of the slides because often there's some good slides in there about studies they've done and so on. But it went from here's a slide deck and feel free to use some slides to here's a slide deck that we want you to use to here's a slide deck that you have to use and you can't add or remove any slides. At which point you're basically doing marketing for the pharmaceutical industry. And we also know that the pharmaceutical industries are not publishing negative studies. So any studies that they support financially that don't show an advantage to their drug, they don't publish. So it's an incredibly biased world. And I finally got to the point where I said, I am just doing marketing for a drug company and it's too biased and I'm not going to do it anymore. But that's how physicians get educated. So we go to these national and international meetings and all our big superstars, right? All the Michael Jordans of gastroenterology. And the same way Nike uses the superstar athletes to make all of us want those sneakers, it's the exact same thing that's happening in the medical world. So they have these key opinion leaders up there who are the thought leaders in our field and are giving the talks and the plenary sessions and so on. And they are essentially, most of them, not all of them, on the payroll of the pharmaceutical industry. And again, that's a world that even the medical people in it don't really realize because it's all done in the name of science and education. And certainly the average person who is on the tail end of this, who is now being told that instead of this drug being the drug to use when all else has failed, they're now being handed this drug the day after they're diagnosed and saying, oh, this drug is great and this is what should be first line. I am all for pharmaceuticals. I am delighted that drugs like Remicade are available for patients who are sick, who are suffering, and who need relief. But they are not being used judiciously. These drugs are being used too aggressively. They're being used too early and too much. And physicians are not having those difficult, labor-intensive conversations with patients about the role of food as medicine, diet and lifestyle, what else can be done, and even more importantly, the root cause of some of these illnesses. So that's really my criticism of the pharmaceutical industry is not that they create these drugs. These drugs can be life-saving, but the indoctrination amongst the medical community to get physicians to start using these drugs in everyone.
Well, it's just so sad, but that's partly why I put my practice on hold to do this podcast, because patients just need to be educated. Everyone needs to be educated, and people don't really understand how corrupt the medical world is. And it's really sad that at the cost of, a patient's life, just to make a profit. But that's what it's come down to. So unless you really educate yourself and become responsible for your own health and seek out doctors who may have a different viewpoint, you're just going to fall prey as a victim to one of those doctors, as you're saying. And it's not the doctor's fault. It's the training and the corruption behind all the pharmaceutical industry. And I've had a pharmaceutical rep on my show. I've had other MDs like yourself on the show that have pulled themselves away because of the corruption in this, and at least talk the truth about it. And that's all people need to know. And I'm sure drugs like Remicade in an acute situation, or if nothing else fails and they've done diet and lifestyle, can be a lifesaver. But to do it as a first thing is so crazy, because there's so many other things that diet and lifestyle take care of.
And in young people too, where you're looking at decades of a drug that we know causes cancer, that we know can cause life-threatening infection, but also a drug that is thousands of dollars per infusion. And we're talking about people getting, anywhere from 4 to sometimes 10 infusions a year for life. So we're talking about billions of dollars in revenue. And we know that really clouds people's judgment.
Yeah, that's so true. And I'm a vegan for a long time. I've been vegan vegetarian since 11, and my show has a lot of plant-based doctors on it. And I've heard you speak on other shows that you really love that diet because it's so high in plant foods and phytonutrients. And, the vegan diet and the paleo diet share a lot in common other than meat, because they don't, do dairy, they don't do sugar, they don't do processed foods. And that's the great thing about the paleo diet, is you get people off of those things and a lot can heal. And although, I am a vegan, I respect the paleo people for doing that. And I think when you were on the Rich Roll podcast or something, you were talking about how you try to eat as much plant-based as possible.
Absolutely.
And that diet that you're talking about, the SCD diet, I think it was called, that's just really high in plant foods, right? And even though it probably has some meat in it, it's probably very high in plant foods because it's high carbs.
Deborah, I want to tell you a little more specifically for your listeners about the diet. So in my book, my second book, The Microbiome Solution, I talk about a combination vegan and paleo diet that I call a valeo diet. My friend Mark Hyman calls it a pagan diet, but I like to emphasize the vegetable part first. So instead of paleo vegan making pagan, I like to call it valeo for vegan paleo. And we looked at our patients. We published a study about 3 years ago of 15 patients with inflammatory bowel disease, a mixture of Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, who had been on SCD or paleo. And we had a very high remission rate. 80% of the patients were in remission. But what was really interesting, and we looked at this in the study group, and we've looked at this in our larger population, is there are clearly two buckets of patients. The ones who do really well, they go into a lasting remission. And by remission, not just feeling well, but when I scope them, I'm talking about mucosal healing, the gold standard for remission in inflammatory bowel disease. So you have the group who do really well and the group who do a little well. And the only difference with those two groups is the number of servings of vegetables. The plant fiber, the indigestible plant fiber. So everybody takes out the dairy, and everybody takes out the sugar, and everybody takes out the gluten, and everybody takes out all the Doritos and the processed carbohydrates, not to pick on Doritos. But some people interpret this diet as, I'm going to have bacon and eggs for breakfast, I'm going to have a chicken breast for lunch, I'm going to have steak for dinner with a little broccoli floret around it. Mm-hmm. And those patients tend not to do as well. The patients who interpret it as, I'm going to have a green smoothie in the morning, or maybe I'm going to have eggs and spinach. I'm going to have a big salad at lunch. I'm going to have roasted vegetables at dinner, maybe with, again, a little bit of fish or chicken on the side, but they get up to this high number of servings of vegetables, do very differently. They're the ones who go into a deep remission. And my friend Terry Walls, who wrote that great book, The Walls Protocol, and healed her own MS, found the same thing. When Terry did a paleo diet, didn't really notice a difference. But when she figured out that on a mitochondrial basis, she needed to be eating 6 to 9 servings of vegetables a day, that's when she got up out of her bed, out of her wheelchair, and started being able to commute to work 8 miles on her bike. And lots of others. So it's true in the gastroenterology world. It's true in the world of MS. It's true in the world of rheumatoid arthritis, etc. It's not enough to just not eat the bad stuff. You have to eat large amounts of the good stuff. And we know that green leafy vegetables are the most underrepresented food in the American diet, less than 7% of what we eat. They're important, not just because they're nutrient rich, but because foods like green leafy vegetables, foods like lentils, foods like oats, have what we call microbiota accessible carbohydrates, MACs, food for your gut bacteria. And there's a landmark study that was done by Paolo Leonetti looking at kids in Burkina Faso and kids in Florence, Italy. And he found the kids, from a microbial point of view, the kids that were born vaginally and breastfed were the same at birth and throughout sort of toddlerhood. But as soon as the kids migrated to the local diet, everything changed. The kids in Florence who were eating a typical Western diet, high in animal protein and fat, had microbial species that were associated with diarrhea, with autoimmune disease, with obesity. They had low microbial richness, and they had low levels of short-chain fatty acids, which are sort of a marker of gut health. The kids in Burkina Faso who were eating a plant-based diet with an occasional termite for animal protein or a very rare free-range chicken every now and again, they had very high microbial richness. They had high levels, double the levels of short-chain fatty acids, and they had all the species that were associated with health. Now, these two groups of kids weren't sick, but this was, looking at the microbiome was like a glimpse into the future. This was a sign of what was to come. So we know that your microbiome, this constellation of bacteria, viruses, fungal organisms, protozoa that live in and on our bodies, the more than 100 trillion microbes, are a huge determinant of whether you get a disease or not. You can have the genes that confer an increased likelihood of celiac disease or Crohn's or MS or cancer. But the epigenetic factors, the environmental factors, the things that we're exposed to, whether it's, glyphosate or different chemicals in the water, or the microbial changes that come about as a result of our diet, or how many antibiotics we took and when we took them, are a huge determinant of whether that disease actually develops or not. And we know microbes in the gut can actually turn genes on and off. And that happens very quickly. And so what genes are activated or inactivated very much depends on what food you're eating and what microbes are present. So it's all really connected. And full disclosure, I'm aspirationally vegan, but not quite there. But I do very much focus on getting enough plant fiber. I start my day with a big green smoothie. I try and have a salad. I try and have more vegetables at night. And I hope to get to the point where there are no animal products in my diet. I haven't quite gotten there yet. In the book, I talk about the 1-2-3 rule: 1 serving of vegetable in the morning, 2 at lunch, 3 at dinner. In my own life, it's reversed because I start my day with a green smoothie. So I get 3 or 4 servings in the morning, and then usually maybe 1 at lunch, at 2 at dinner. But if you're stranded on a desert island and I only have one thing to give you, and I could give you the fanciest, most expensive probiotic or a drug or anything I have to give you, I would choose vegetables.
Yeah, that's what so many doctors have come to say, that the higher level of vegetables, or the more you can slide the scale towards the vegan plant-based diet, the healthier you will be in any disease, not just gastroenterology, diseases, but look, like you said, rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, I've seen cancer, so many things, because in my homeopathic practice, I learned how much importance the microbiome really is, because I would get all these really sick people, and sometimes they don't even complain about gut issues, but then the more you get into your practice and the more patients you see, you start realizing that there's something going on underneath that's happening. And even though they don't have the diarrhea or the constipation, or they think they don't have any gut issues, you realize that the gut is really at the basis of our health. And I learned a lot about how important it is. And it's not so fast to fix, but I've seen diet changes do amazing things.
It is the engine. It's sort of funny, because when I graduated from medical school, now almost 26 years ago, gastroenterology was not a sort of appealing field. People were going into dermatology and orthopedics and ophthalmology, and those were kind of the exciting fields. And people were sort of like, gastroenterology? Why do you want to do that? And so it's really cool now, fast forward 25 years later, where everybody's excited about the gut. And people are really realizing that it is the engine, and it is sort of where everything emanates from. If you don't have a healthy engine, if the source of all the nutrients and the energy for the cells is not healthy, it's really difficult for the rest of the body to be healthy. And it is so beautifully simple. We get very caught up in this whole concept of nutritionism and how many grams of protein and net carbs and all this stuff. But it is really simple. And I love Michael Pollan's 7 simple words of eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
Yeah, that's a great
better
line.
Advice than that. Absolutely.
For sure. So you were talking about the trillions of organisms that our bodies are made of. So are we less human than microbial?
We are, because our microbial cells outnumber our human cells about 10 to 1. So again, about 100 trillion microbes and more than 1 billion bacteria in just one drop of fluid from your colon alone. We can't see these critters, but if we were to scrape them all up, they would weigh about 3 or 4 pounds. And of course, most of them are located in the gut. But the microbiome is different in every part of the body. If you look at the GI tract, as you go from the top of it, from the mouth all the way down to the bottom of it, the anus, the oxygen content changes dramatically. The amount of bacteria change, a type of bacteria change. So you have a lot more bacteria at the end of the colon than you do, for example, in the middle of the small intestine. And if you think about the bacteria on our skin, the bacteria in the nasolabial fold, that sort of deep fold at the bottom of the cheek, completely different from the bacteria 2 millimeters away, higher up outside of the fold, because the moisture is different, the oil content is different, the oxygen content is different. And they're all very specialized. They're all there for a reason. They all do different things. And when you disrupt them and you mess with them, you disrupt your own health and you mess up your own health. So I spend a lot of time not just trying to get people to stop taking all the antibiotics and the steroids and the NSAIDs and the birth control pills and the things that mess up the gut microbiome, but to stop lathering themselves from head to toe with all these cleansers that disrupt the skin and scalp microbiome.
And are you meaning the cleansers that have the antibacterial?
Oh, absolutely. But even the regular shampoos and cleansers with the sulfates and the sulfites. And, we're not really dirty. We have the oils that are secreted by our scalp and our skin are there to nourish and protect our scalp and skin. And so we suds them up and wash them all off. And then we try and replace them with some store-bought version. So a little gentle rinsing, getting in the nooks and crannies is not a bad idea, especially if things get a little pungent. But we don't need to be super sanitized from head to toe because, again, those oils and those microbes are there to keep us healthy. If you look at a condition like eczema, About 94% of people in the US who have eczema are colonized with a form of staph, a less healthy form of staph. And so it really makes you wonder how the use of all these cleansers, all these soaps and suds and lathering cleansers that really strip our oils and strip our microbes, how they contribute to conditions like this, because they really change the microbial content of the skin and they decrease the microbial richness. So they have the same, even though they're not, even the ones that aren't specifically antimicrobial, they're still removing bacteria because of the harshness and the chemicals in them.
Well, and what about these antibacterial wipes that everyone does at the stores and all these antibacterial lotions that they do on their hands every time? Is that called triclosan? Isn't that the name of the ingredient?
Yes, triclosan is one of the main ingredients. And kudos to the FDA, who last fall passed a bill that said that triclosan needs to be out of personal care products by this September 2017. Now, unfortunately, they left it in toothpaste, so you can't put it on your skin, but you can ingest it. But triclosan is an endocrine disruptor. You know, it's one of the things that can lead to things like precocious puberty and other abnormalities, and it's a microbial disruptor. And what's really ironic, Deborah, is that most of the time we're using hand sanitizer with antimicrobials in it to prevent viral illnesses against which an antimicrobial has no activity. So we're usually using them to prevent colds and flus, which are caused by viruses.
Yeah.
And you would do a lot better to do simple hand washing with warm water and a mild soap, scrubbing your hands to dislodge the viral particles in the palm of your hand, scrubbing for about as long as it takes to sing one verse, a happy birthday. Rather than putting on all these chemicals, and especially with kids, I would much rather my kid eat some dirt than eat triclosan and some of these other chemicals.
Well, it's funny because I remember I have your book. I bought it when it came out. And I remember you were talking about eating clean and living dirty.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that line, what you mean by that.
By eating clean, I mean eating food that actually is dirty. I mean eating food that is not sort of, manufactured in a factory, but eating food that doesn't have pesticides and genetically modified ingredients in it, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes. What we talk about when we say eating a clean diet, a diet without a lot of unprocessed food, but living dirty. So not constantly super sanitizing ourselves and removing the microbes and getting a little bit more up close and personal with nature, whether it's opening a window to let some fresh air and microbes in, planting a garden, getting a dog, taking fewer showers, all of these things that are really important parts of being healthy, and recognizing that we are animals. We are so removed from nature, and the more domesticated we become, the unhealthier we become in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and don't you think that our society's kind of a little bit like clean freaks?
Oh my goodness, we're crazy. Well, you think of the term cleanliness is next to godliness. And we really think that the cleaner we are, the healthier we are. And again, the incredible irony here that it's turning out to be probably the opposite. Now, there are places where it's good to be clean. It's good to be clean in the operating room. It's good so that wounds don't get infected. But it's not good to be super clean like that on the playground or in the classroom. It's okay for the kids to go outside and play in the dirt. In fact, not only is it okay, it's essential, because all the studies show us that kids who do not have enough exposure to nature, to soil and dirt and animals and so on, tend to have problems with things like asthma and hay fever and eczema, and in general have more autoimmune disease later on. So it's part of the immune system getting trained, being exposed to germs and being able to figure out, okay, this one, no problem. This one, got to be careful with this one. Let's mount a big immune response. This is a bad one. So if they don't have that constant exposure early on, they tend to overreact when they get exposed to germs, and lo and behold, they now have an immune disease, an autoimmune disease. And this is the whole basis for the hygiene hypothesis, which is just sort of a fascinating concept in medicine. In the 1950s, David Strawn, who was a researcher at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, was tasked with trying to figure out why they were seeing skyrocketing rates of hay fever and eczema in the sort of post-industrial London. And he embarked on a 28-year epidemiological study looking at over 17,000 kids from birth to essentially adulthood. And he made two astounding discoveries. The first was that kids who lived in families with a lot of siblings, kids from large families, had very low levels of hay fever and eczema because they had donors. They had siblings who were sneezing on them and coughing on them and giving them mumps and measles and chickenpox and the flu. And that was immunizing them. It was training their immune system not to overreact down the road. The other really surprising discovery was that kids from more affluent households who at that time, more affluence translated to loftier standards of personal hygiene, those kids had very high rates of hay fever and eczema because they were washing all the time. They were too clean. So this turned the whole idea of the association in our minds in the medical community between cleanliness and health on its head and really made us question, is it maybe a bad idea to be too clean? And if we look at a map of the world today, we see that same sort of developed world, less developed world split. If we look at any autoimmune disease from Crohn's and colitis to MS, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, we see high levels in the more developed world and low levels in the less developed world. And as countries become more industrialized, and we're seeing this in the Middle East and India and the Caribbean, we start to see increasing rates of autoimmune disease. And it's not just a McDonald's effect. It's not just that people are eating more processed food. It's widespread chlorination of the water. And, these things are difficult because chlorine in the water help to prevent cholera, and that's a good thing. But it also kills off all the microbes in the water, the healthy ones too. So some of these things are a double-edged sword. But it's just fascinating to see the world changing and to see these diseases kind of getting imported to some of the less developed countries as they become super sanitized too, and as they start having access to widespread antibiotics.
Now, what about things like, dangerous viruses that are out there like staph or strep, or there's a lot of new ones that people worry about? Is
like Zika?
Yeah, exactly. Now, would there be any argument that someone would say, well, I need to stay away from those, so I need to, wash myself and make sure I don't get any of those. But are you getting the benefit of strengthening your body to fight those by kind of living dirty?
Absolutely. So a couple things. The first is that people who take frequent antibiotics have fewer healthy bacteria in their body. And it's those healthy bacteria that can crowd out a virus and keep it from proliferating and keep it from taking root and causing infection. So our healthy bacteria are sort of our body's own innate antivirals. And we see that all the time during cold and flu season, that everybody knows that person who never gets sick. I mean, they could be in the emergency room in the midst of a flu epidemic. They are never sick. Not because they're not exposed, but because their body has a healthy complement of bacteria that can drown out whatever that bad character is that's gotten into their body. And there are a lot of things that determine that. For example, we know that people on a cruise ship, when there's a viral outbreak, like there's norovirus or something on a cruise ship, people who have been on a lot of antibiotics, people who take acid-suppressing drugs, people on steroids, those people are all at increased risk for getting infection. So it's very important for people to think less in terms of germ theory and more in terms of a term called terrain. Important for you to consider what your terrain is, your inner landscape, your inner soil. Is that healthy? If it's healthy, the few weeds that grow are fine. They're not going to overgrow. But if your terrain is unhealthy, then those things are going to take root and they're going to grow out of control and you're going to end up getting infected. So rather than trying to sort of cocoon yourself in a bubble where you're never exposed to any bad bacteria or viruses, it's way more important and way more effective to have a healthy terrain, to avoid those drugs that kill off your healthy bacteria, to strengthen your immune system with a lot of contact with nature, to strengthen your microbiome by eating a lot of indigestible plant fiber, get a lot of sleep. Those are the things that keep you healthy. My husband is the healthiest vegetable eater I know. He has a green smoothie in the morning, he has a salad at lunch, he has another salad at dinner, more vegetables, and he goes to bed at 9:30 most nights. He is never sick.
You know, I preach that all the time because health is not one thing. It's like a pie, and you can eat a great diet, but if you're getting 4 hours of sleep, you're gonna get sick, and it's not going to be good. There's so many things you have to do to stay healthy. But yeah, more vegetables, obviously, the better. But you still have to sleep. You still have to move. You still have to, do the right things, not take drugs, build your immune system. And it comes down really to that it's about really training and building our immune system to be as strong as possible so that whatever it comes in contact with, it can fight itself instead of worrying about the very thing and suppressing that one thing. Just keep working on building your immune system, which sleep is a big part of it.
And it's not a pill, and it's why I have such respect for the work that you and others do with really educating people. And it is such a positive, optimistic message. We are the architects of our own health. Sure, sometimes you get dealt a bad hand of cards, you sort of get bad genes, or something does fall out of the sky into your lap, some freak thing. But most of what we suffer from and most of what can kill us is stuff that we have control over. Most of the cardiovascular mortality in this country is what we consider excess cardiovascular mortality. It's preventable. And you read books like Caldwell Esselstyn's great book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, and you realize, he took people who were cardiac cripples. He took people who the cardiologist had said, I have nothing more to offer you. You're going to die from heart disease. And putting them on a low-fat, plant-based diet was able to reverse heart disease in these people. This is real. We have control over whether we get sick or not and how and what we die from to a large degree. And this is the thing that I'm most passionate about as a physician. That sense of our own power has been taken from us by the medical community. The medical community scares people into thinking they have to take a drug, they have to do a test, or something bad is going to happen. And I want people to be comfortable and to be confident that they are doing what they can do and what they need to do to prevent these things. And again, nothing is 100%, right? Bad things sometimes happen to good people, even to good vegans. But there is so much that you can do to make yourself healthy, to make your family healthy, and so that you don't have that constant looking over your shoulder, and something's going to get me. That you feel relaxed and confident and happy, and really, I think, reap the benefits of this good health. And so this is a work that I think we all do, and that we're not anti-medicine and anti-drugs and anti-testing, but we are proactive in terms of what can we do, what can we eat, what can we drink, what thoughts can we have, how can we move, what can we do to be healthy.
Time to take your break and get your walk in or a drink. I want to take a minute here to first tell you guys that if you had asked to be my friend on Facebook and you never got a reply for the last year, I apologize. I'm not good at Facebook. And the other day I went in and I just accepted hundreds, I think. So don't be hurt. It's nothing personal. I just don't have a lot of time to go on Facebook. I don't really understand how it works, but I just want to say that in case any of you out there were wondering about that. Also, I just want to thank all of you guys that are using my Amazon banner on my site. You know how much I appreciate that. It's a simple way to support the show, but it means the world to me. All you have to do is click on that Amazon banner on my website, which is vidalspeaks.com, and then you can just bookmark that page. So when you click on your bookmark, each time it'll take you directly to Amazon, but through my link. And they just send me a commission, but it's without any cost to you. And I don't get to see who's ordering what, so your personal information is totally private. It's a great way to give back and help the show keep going. So I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate you guys. Okay, and lastly, just remember, keep sharing the show with friends, whether they're interested in health or they're sick or they're healthy. Just share the show as best you can. Please ask them to review the show if you've done so already. It's so helpful. Sadly, that's what iTunes uses, but if you guys would take the minute to do that, I so appreciate that. But I just want to tell you that it's really important to just spread the word of the show, because the more people that we share it with, the more our work of helping the world and getting people well becomes a reality. Okay, now let's get back to the show. Well, for me, the first start is what do you have to lose? Go on a plant-based diet and see what doesn't get better. But don't make your first line of action going to your doctor, having him fear you into taking a drug, because that's what they do. And it's sad. And part of that is because that's how they're trained. I honestly believe most doctors out there really want to help people. And the doctors like you and Dr. Esselton and all these other clinical doctors that see patients that have come to this place where they're helping people, now in a much more natural way, had to get there in time. They had to be frustrated that what they were doing wasn't working. They had to feel bad enough that they went into that field to help people and they weren't seeing the results that they had hoped. And so then they searched a little further. Some doctors never get there. They just keep doing their protocol, and other doctors get there, but their intentions want to help people, but we just have to know that it's not the doctor that's dangerous. It's what the doctor's been trained and told, and the drugs that are the only tools he knows how to use. So it's super important. Knowledge is power. If you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the ambition to put your health in your own hands, you're going to fall to the hands of these drugs at some point in your life. And by the time something happens, you're not going to have the energy to learn all this stuff. So I teach everything I have learned and know to my listeners, because I want everybody to share it with everybody they know so that the world can get better, because it's really sick right now. People are sick.
But, it is changing. I spoke at a wonderful conference last fall called the Plantrition Project that was started by Dr. Stoll. And it was in Anaheim, California, and there were over 800 physicians there, and all interested in food as medicine and plants as medicine. And what was really fascinating, Deborah, is how many of them had a personal story of transformation. I met a pediatric neurologist who had a stroke in his 30s. I met a woman who had lupus in medical school, who was approaching dialysis and kidney failure and really turned things around. And sometimes that's what it takes. And you had asked me at the beginning of the podcast about how I got here. And I talked about, seeing the changes in my inflammatory bowel disease patients and so on. But really the part that I left out that I want to share with you is my daughter, Sydney, who just turned 12. So a little over 12 years ago, I was at Georgetown Hospital giving birth, my first and only child. I was what they call advanced maternal age at 39, but I was very healthy. I had no chronic diseases. I was on no drugs. I'm a marathon runner and a yogi, squash player, snowboarder, very healthy. So I was there in labor. And like many women, when they offered the epidural, I accepted because labor is painful and I didn't know better at the time. And of course, the epidural increases your likelihood of having a C-section because it slows down the progression of the labor. And sure enough, I had failure to progress after several hours of labor and was told I needed a C-section. Now, I'd had the flu that year. I did not get the flu shot. Like many people, there was a shortage of the flu shot, and I was pregnant and didn't want to get a flu shot. I'd had the flu. I've found that whether or not I get the flu doesn't really seem to be directly correlated with whether I've had a flu shot. But I had the flu that year. And because of my flu, when she came out, even though she was healthy, they decided to put her in the NICU, in the neonatal intensive care unit, and decided to prophylactically evaluate her for infection, all of which was fine. They did a spinal tap and x-rays and so on. Okay. But they also decided to prophylactically give her intravenous antibiotics. So you have a newborn that's born via C-section. So she's bypassed that essential moment of traveling through the birth canal. That's when the baby swallows a mouthful of microbes in that area between the vagina and the rectum. That's why babies are born vaginally, so that can happen. And that's when babies get colonized with their founding species. And that is arguably the most important moment of our lives, when we're born and colonized with microbes. So babies born via C-section miss out on that. And studies show that they're colonized with hospital-acquired staph and other less desirable microbes instead of bifido and lactobacillus and so on. So my daughter, Sydney, was born via C-section. And then to add insult to injury, she's given 2 very high doses of intravenous antibiotics. So whatever few little microbes she had, gone. And then a series of unfortunate events. My breast milk dried up after about 6 weeks, and probably as a result of all the antibiotics I had also been given. And we know that breast milk is an essential part of nurturing a healthy microbiome. The third most common ingredient in breast milk is something called HMOs, human milk oligosaccharides, completely indigestible by babies because it's not there to feed the baby. It's there to feed the baby's gut bacteria, so that the gut bacteria can thrive and can repel staph on the mother's nipple. I mean, it's amazing. You could not make this up. This is so beautifully designed. So my poor daughter, born via C-section, only 6 weeks of breast milk and IV antibiotics to boot at birth. And starting at about 3 months, she was just sick all the time, literally like clockwork. Every month we were at the pediatrician. She'd have a high fever, a sore throat, be really sick, and they would just give her an antibiotic. And what was really frightening, Deborah, is that nobody was keeping track. They'd kind of look at the last page of the chart and say, oh, well, she got amoxicillin this time. Let's give her something else this time. She got that last time. And one day when she was about 2, I went home, and I'm an obsessive filer, and I pulled out all the prescription, copies of the prescriptions. And I made a little spreadsheet, and I realized she had had almost 20 courses of antibiotics, and she was not yet 2. Not yet 2. And I realized that if we kept going that way, something terrible was going to happen, because this was the exact history I was seeing in many of my patients with serious autoimmune disease, with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Multiple antibiotics, their tonsils out, and then antibiotics for acne in high school, and then lo and behold, in college, they have Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And we know that. We have data now that shows that antibiotics early in life dramatically increases your chance of having an autoimmune disease. And, you know, the thing is, she was still sick despite all the antibiotics. Her poor little immune system just couldn't get going. So I finally decided, you know what? We're not going to the doctor. And here, let me point out that I am a physician, so it was okay for me to make that decision. I am not recommending that your listeners out there stop going to the doctor. But what I am recommending is that they go armed with questions. Is that antibiotic absolutely necessary? What would happen if I or my child did not take the antibiotic? What are the sort of red flag signs to look for? What's a natural course of this illness? What's the downside of taking this antibiotic? Questions that I myself, as a very well-trained physician, did not ask. Why? Because I assumed that the physician, who's a wonderful, wonderful, well-meaning woman, knew what she was doing. And the reality is that physicians often don't. They are poorly informed about the downside of the drugs they're prescribing. They're poorly informed about alternative therapies. And that's a first mistake you make, is thinking that they know.
Yeah, well, the sad thing is they don't really have other weapons unless they're like you that have decided to go and train and learn other things. It's kind of all they've got.
It's
so if
all
they don't give you that,
but you know, the studies in the pediatric literature show that pediatricians prescribe antibiotics about 63% of the time when they think the parent expects it, and 7% when they don't. So there's an incredible gray zone where pediatricians, it's almost like a flip of a coin. So you need to be that parent who goes in there saying, I don't want an antibiotic unless I don't have a choice, unless death is imminent or whatever your bar is. I'm not suggesting that's a realistic bar. But if you go in there saying, my kid is sick and, you need to do something now. So as consumers, we also need to change and we need to be willing to be sick. We need to understand that sometimes you just have to be sick. You got to lay in bed, drink some green juice, and just rest and wait to get better.
For sure, everyone's looking for the fast pill so they can go back to work, but you just need to let your body heal. But I have a question, Dr. Chutkan, when you were talking about in the hospital when they prophylactically gave your daughter IV antibiotics, could you legally as a parent say no to that?
Oh, of course. Of course. I signed a general consent for the NICU. And again, this is 12 years ago. I had not had my aha moment. I fervently believed in the benefit of prophylactic therapy and so on. I had no idea. I didn't know what the microbiome was 12 years ago. And I don't think any of the physicians, any of my colleagues at Georgetown Hospital did either. We really had no idea. Almost all the data and all the studies showing the contribution of antibiotics, especially in kids, to developing autoimmune disease and problems down the road have come about in the last 5 to 7 years, maybe 10 years. But 12 years ago, there was nothing. We literally did not know. And so I can't hold these physicians accountable. They were doing what they knew how to do. They were acting in the best interest of my child. I know that. But unfortunately, there were some things they didn't know. And what I signed was a general consent for the NICU for my daughter to have what's called a sepsis workup for infection and general treatment. It's really almost impossible in the hospital for them to come to you for every single thing because, I could be sleeping and she could have an infection. And so it's sort of a general consent to treat. I didn't even know that she got IV antibiotics until several months after when I requested the records from the birth, from the hospitalization. And I saw, oh my goodness, she got intravenous antibiotics just in case as part of their sepsis protocol that they do, even though, again, she was fine. And, it could have been different. She could have had when you have a baby who's born and the mom has a fever, yes, it was a flu, but they don't know. I could have had some life-threatening infection. It could have been passed on to her. And they were doing what they thought was the right thing. I wish I could get a redo. I would have my baby at home. I would do it very differently. But this is sort of where we were, and this is still where we are in medicine. I still see very good dermatologists putting kids on tetracycline for acne and having no idea how they're dramatically increasing the risk of that kid developing an autoimmune disease or a serious problem down the road. And they just don't know. So as consumers, we have to realize that nothing is free when it comes to drugs. My sister broke her elbow last Wednesday. My sister, I'm very proud of her. She's a federal judge, and she's probably one of the few federal judges who commutes to the courthouse by bicycle. And we live here in Washington, and it's a beautiful ride through Rock Creek Park. But unfortunately, just a few blocks from her house, she went over the handlebars and broke her elbow. And thought, well, I'm just going to sort of, change and drive to work and I'll be okay. And then at work, the nurse down there at the courthouse said, Judge, your elbow looks really bad. I think you should get it x-rayed. I arranged for her to have an x-ray. And sure enough, she had a terrible, terrible fracture. And she had to have emergent surgery the next day, a screw and a plate, several screws and a plate. She had the surgery on Friday and they gave her some pain medication. It was a really bad break, and she has all this hardware in her elbow. So she took a couple Percocet, and she took an Advil, as her surgeon had advised her. And then she proceeded to vomit up everything she ate for the next day. And I said to her, honey, I'm so sorry, but nothing is free. The Percocet and the Advil you took helped to alleviate the pain, but now you're having GI distress. So you have to choose. Do you want your elbow to hurt or you want your stomach to hurt? And she found a happy medium with some Tylenol. But part of the problem is that we have all been educated by the medical community to think that we have a pill for every ill and that it's magic. There's no downside. You feel sad? Take a happy pill. Your pain, take a pain pill.
Right.
And yes, these things can alleviate problems, but they come at a price. So it's important for people to know the true price of these things, just like it's important for them to know the true price of the food they're eating, the true price of things. And so that we can make informed decisions about these things, and we can decide, I'm going to take this pain medication, even though it may make me feel terribly nauseated and vomit, because it's worth it. It's worth it to do it.
I know, and so many people, look, I'm a professional golfer, and people pop Advil every day, and they just live in denial. It's so sad. But one question I wanted to know, if you could do it over, or for advice out there for other mothers who have to give birth cesarean, is there anything they could do to make up for that baby not going through the canal?
This whole experience was honestly the main motivation for me writing the second book, The Microbiome Solution. My first book, Gutbliss, is a great read, but the second book, The Microbiome Solution, I'm the most proud of, because I think there's information in there that can really change people's lives and change people's health for the better. I have an entire birth plan in the book, which my OBGYN friends are so pissed at me about. They're like, you're so annoying with your birth plan, and all the patients come in and they want to know this and that, and it's really annoying. But one of the amazing low-tech things you can do is this whole concept of vaginal reseeding. Not something I made up. This is something that researchers have been looking at, where you just take a little piece of gauze and you soak it in the juices, in the perineal juices, of vaginal juices, that area between the vagina and the rectum. And after the baby's born via C-section, you just swab them down, especially their head, paying attention to the mouth and the nose and so on, kind of mimicking what happens with a vaginal birth. It's an incredibly inexpensive, low-tech way of reseeding the baby. But it's very important that your birth team knows what's going on, because in most hospitals, when a baby's born via C-section, they take the baby and they start sterilizing them. They start wiping them down with all these antibacterial products, just the very opposite of what they should be doing. So you have to educate your team, you have to educate your doctor, and you have to let them know, this is the difference between a C-section and a vaginal birth. Do not assume your OBGYN knows this. Chances are they don't. I didn't know this before I wrote the book. And say, this is a difference. And so this is what I want to do. And here are the studies. And this is a perfectly safe thing to do. And this is what I want to do. And you have to get buy-in. And please do not leave your conventional doctor behind. Educate them, help them, open their eyes. I am so grateful to the hundreds of wonderful patients I have who trusted me enough to say to me, this is what I'm doing and it's really helping. And I want you to know, and maybe you can recommend it to another patient. That's how we learn. So, don't abandon your doctor and say, I have to go find a naturopath who believes in this. I mean, that's fine too. But, open your doctor's eyes so that they can learn, and then they can recommend it for the next person who comes along.
Yeah, that's a great point, because then as we all learn from our patients, you're allowing your doctor to learn too. And if they're closed to it and they're not open to that, then you can find another doctor.
Absolutely.
Have you ever heard of Dr. Chinois? His book is called The Enzyme Factor.
I have not, no.
He's a gastroenterologist. You should read it. You would like it. It's a very short book. It's been one of my favorite, and I gave it to a lot of my patients with gut problems.
I will definitely read it.
But he does a lot of colonoscopies, I think he said something like a couple 100,000 now, but he's the one that invented the actual device where when they're in the colonoscopy that can cut off the polyps. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I believe I'm correct on that, but
the snare,
anyway, his wife, he's Japanese, and they moved from Japan to the New York. And as they started eating the more Americanized diet than their traditional diet, his wife got sick, and she had her first child, and their child had some kind of skin problem. Second child, same thing. His wife was getting sicker. She ended up dying of lupus.
Oh, no.
And he figured how it was all from the dairy they were drinking, because they don't drink dairy in Japan. So anyways, it's a great story, but he recommends, he does put a little fish in the diet, but everything else is plants. But he was talking, what was interesting is out of the couple 100,000 colonoscopies he's done, even when people aren't sick, when he does them, he can tell who's a meat eater and who's a plant eater.
Oh, absolutely. You can smell it. And you can smell when there's inflammation. So the minute I put the scope in the colon, I can tell whether there's inflammation, even with my eyes closed. The smell, the microbes are different. It's amazing.
Wow.
It's really amazing. It has nobody's colon smells lovely, but it has a very sour off smell that's different from just normal healthy stool smelling. And I can tell with my eyes closed what's going on in that colon.
Yeah, and he was saying that especially like Japanese, they tend to do really bad on dairy. Mm-hmm. And he can tell like just by the color of the mucosa. And anyways, it's a very interesting book. You might enjoy it.
And tell me the name again, Deborah.
It's called The Enzyme Factor.
The Enzyme Factor.
And his name is Dr. Shinwa's Shinya.
Yeah, I do recognize a name now that you mentioned the snare. I think he was a gastroenterologist, maybe at Lenox Hill or someplace in New York, because the name is very familiar.
Yeah, you'll when you read the intro, you'll know who he is. But anyways, I just wondered if you had. But I just think that's very interesting that even your mucosa looks so different when you eat lots of plants versus people who are eating, even just a heavy meat diet that aren't eating junk. He could tell the difference.
And for those of you out there listening who are meat eaters, who are omnivores, it's, it's if you want to go vegan tomorrow, great. But what I want to ask you to do is try to eat more plants. That's so important. And if you crowd out the meat on your plate and crowd out the processed carbs with more plants. So, if you still want to eat a little animal protein, fine. I mean, there are other reasons to not eat that, other sort of moral and ethical reasons. But if you have decided that you're not giving up animal protein, fine. Eat more plants. And when I say more plants, I don't mean veggie chips or a fruit roll-up. I mean an actual plant that was grown in the soil, because the plants that you're eating are only as healthy as the soil they're grown in. And many of our plants, even the organic ones, are actually grown in a factory. It's some industrial organic factory where they're churning out these plants. So make sure your food is grown in microbe-rich soil, and even better, grow some yourself if you've got a little room to do it.
Yeah, and another thing I learned, that when people eat meat, that has to do with the bacteria that the meat produces, and It's called TMAO, right?
Trimethylamine oxide. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so TMAO producers, which we see in meat eaters, is very strongly linked to atherosclerotic heart disease. And people who are vegans, even when they are given meat to eat, cannot produce a TMAO. So it's only in people who are habitually eating meat. And it is absolutely one of the things related to atherosclerotic heart disease. And it's why, and you'll hear more about this in Dr. Esselstyn's book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. It's why you see very little heart disease in hardcore plant eaters in vegan. And I'll tell you, having been in the operating room, when they pull that plaque out of the artery, that's not kale. That's straight up lard that they're pulling out. So
yeah, and it's hard to defy science when you can see that a vegan, even when they're fed meat, doesn't make it. I mean, How can you argue that eating meat is better than eating plants? I mean, there's nothing to argue. The experiment is clear. So I love that. And I think Dr. Greger's talked about that a lot, but that's so cool. Does it take a long time for people to change their microbiome?
In a beautiful study that was published in Nature and done at Harvard a few years ago, there have been lots of studies comparing, for example, Dr. Leonetti's study I mentioned, where they looked at kids in Burkina Faso and kids in Florence, Italy. But this was a study where they looked at the same 9 volunteers and they put them on a typical Atkins diet with pork rinds and prosciutto and cheese for about 5 days. And they looked at the microbiome before, during, and after. And then they rested them for a couple weeks. And they put them on a plant-based diet: jasmine rice, lentils, tomatoes, fruit for snack. And they found, Deborah, that within about 30 hours of the food hitting the gut, the microbiome started to change dramatically. They saw a decrease in the biophilia, the bile-loving bacteria that are typically overrepresented in people who eat a lot of meat. And they saw the levels of short chain fatty acids, those important compounds start to go up. And even more importantly, they saw that the genes that were turned on and off started to change within about 30 hours. So, in 2 days, you can literally in 2 days start to change your life and change your health.
That's encouraging. Always good to know that things can turn around fast. And I can't let you go without asking you about probiotics, because I get asked this question all the time by listeners. Which probiotics that you recommend, but also, are they important for just everybody to take, or do they work?
Absolutely not. There is no evidence that the average healthy person could or should take a probiotic or will benefit from it in any way. Number one, just like vitamins, there's no evidence. There's specific disease states and specific circumstances, and the same with vitamins. If you're deficient in vitamin D, good idea to take a supplement. If you have Crohn's and your B12 is low, good idea to take a supplement. But this idea of taking a multivitamin, not only is it not helpful, but there's sometimes things in a multivitamin and things in a probiotic that are not great for you to be taking. All probiotics are not created equal. You have to know what the number of colony-forming units is, what the different strains are. Ideally, it should be multiple strains that are synergistic and work together to accomplish something. The probiotic that your yoga instructor took for her diarrhea might not be the same probiotic that's helpful for your skin condition. And again, no matter how good the probiotic, if you are not eating a diet to support the growth of that bacteria, you're not accomplishing anything. You have to choose between a probiotic and the food. Choose a food. Eat more plants.
And is there a probiotic that you use in your practice that you like the best?
There is one that we use particularly in our patients with inflammatory bowel disease. It's been well studied. It's considered a medical food for ulcerative colitis. It's called VSL number 3. But again, I can't make that as a general recommendation for everyone because it depends on what they have. For my patients with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, that probiotic along with the dietary change seems to work very well. But, again, I think it's really the food that's the bulk of it for these patients.
I agree. Like I say, it's kind of like homeopathy. You can have 10 cases of sinusitis and they'll all need 10 different remedies. So you got to use it, as very personalized medicine and treat the whole person.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So lastly, just tell people how they can follow you. I'll put the links for your website and your books in the show notes, but let people know how they can follow you.
You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Chutkan, Chutkan. You can find us at Gutbliss, GUTBLISS.com. And you can come and see me at the Digestive Center for Wellness in Chevy Chase, Maryland.
Fantastic. Dr. Robynne, you're the best. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Keep on speaking.
Okay, I will. Thank you. Well, isn't it cool, the idea of eating clean and living dirty? And that's far from what most people are doing, because it's scary how many people use these antibacterial creams, soaps, wipes with all that triglyceride in them, and that's just not letting anyone's immune system work anymore. Not to say how dangerous that stuff is. That was good news to me to hear they're going to take it off the market next year. But meanwhile, look how many products they've sold it in for the last years. Why not just put oregano oil in distilled water in a spray bottle, or lavender in distilled water and spray something natural for when you need it? And I love the idea of putting your feet in the ground because it's so important to health. She talked about having pets and getting in the yard and playing in the dirt. It's not just for the gut, but it's just necessary because the earth has so much energy. It's kind of a magnet energy that's so healing. So be sure to find a place that's not sprayed with pesticides. Best to go in nature or to the ocean and just walk barefoot. That's healing in so many ways. It gets you out of the daily stress, quiets your mind, puts your feet in contact with the earth's healing magnet energies, and it helps you get stronger in resisting bad bugs. You got nothing to lose. And the other thing I loved about what she said today, and it's great for you guys to hear from a medical doctor's mouth, is about the corruption behind the pharmaceutical industry. Do you see what I mean? It's what I've been saying. This isn't just me having a suspicion. This is coming from a doctor. I couldn't believe when she was saying how when she gets invited to speak at a conference, they first butter her all up and say, oh, we love your work and you're so good. And then you get there and you bring your PowerPoint presentation, which they tell you can do. But then when you get there, they hand you a PowerPoint presentation and they say you can't stray from it. You have to do exactly that one. That is so corrupt and so wrong, and that they think they're just disclosing that these doctors are receiving millions or thousands of dollars from these pharmaceutical companies, and that's okay then because they've at least exposed it. That's ridiculous. So I'm so happy she told us all about that lie. And for those of you out there that are expecting moms, remember what she said about the importance of swabbing the baby if you're having a cesarean, because it's a birth not through the vaginal canal. Therefore, they miss out on all that really important early life bacteria. So I thought that was great advice, and you should tell that to anyone you know having a baby, because there's so many cesareans this day and age. A good microbiome starts at birth, and this tip can be a lifesaver to start a child's life off in the right, healthy direction. I love Dr. Robynne's idea of getting well by learning to rewild yourself and just not worry so much about bugs. That's a very cool way about thinking of it. Really, it's like we've been saying all along, we need to work mostly on just building our immune system instead of being so fearful of one bug and taking something dangerous to prevent it, because it doesn't really prevent it. It's just weakening your immune system, and then it exposes you to many other bugs. So you can see how far she's come from her initial education after medical school, but her birth experience with her child taught her that something wasn't right about all those antibiotics. And like I said, you never see me smiling bigger than when I see an MD who sees the light and the truth. So I'm always pleased to see medical doctors that are turning more to natural ways and trying to help people get off their drugs. That's awesome. Congratulations, Dr. Robynne. All right, you guys, I hope you enjoyed the show today. You know what time it is. It's time to say goodbye. Vidal has spoken. Remember, you heal with a plant-powered diet, homeopathy, and detoxing. Of course. Peace. Be healthy. Be free. Live life.